his blood shall run. There can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun.
Hello, comrades, and welcome back to Season 5, Episode 4 of Spectre. I'm delighted today to be joined by returning guest, Keith Stoddart. Keith, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's good to be back.
Oh, great stuff. So I guess just diving straight into it, Keith, just a wee kind of introduction from yourself, you know, who you are, your affiliations and everything else in between.
Okay, I'm still called Keith Stoddart. I'm still a member of the Communist Party. I'm actually the chair of the party in Scotland, and I'm also a member of the Whole Island National Executive. But in terms of May Day, I suppose it's more to do with my trade union activity. A chair of the Glasgow and West of Scotland branch of Unite Community, and I'm also the Scottish chair of the Scottish Community Forum, which is basically all the branches in Scotland, and as such, I represent Scotland along with there's two delegates on the National Unite Forum, which is for all the community branches, both in this island, the island next door, and for those who are familiar with the structure of Unite, it's literally a NISC, so National Industrial Sectorial Conference. So it's a complicated way of saying I wear a few hats.
But yeah, I guess going on today's episode is just about kind of May Day, International Workers' Day, as it's also referred to. One of those things where the history of it isn't very well known, certainly not amongst kind of your average member in a trade union where it's very heavily championed. So just looking to see if you can give us a kind of origins to May Day, where it's kind of began and essentially what it is.
Well, May Day has actually always been a celebration. It was in Britain. It, I suppose, goes back to pagan origins. It's about, rebirth, like it's the fertility rites and all sorts of things, dancing around the maypole and such. If you actually think about it, it's a phallic symbol. But in terms of it being a celebration of workers, trade unions, industrial workers, it started in the States as a result of what was known as the Haymarket Massacre, which was in 1886 in Chicago, where workers were striking for an 8-hour workday. Sounds familiar. Faced violent police repression. So to a certain extent, in 1886, what was happening in the States was what happened in Glasgow in January 1919. The police rioted. So that happened around the 1st of May, that demonstration in 1886 in Chicago. And since the following year, there was a memorial march, if you like, and that very quickly spread literally worldwide. It was supported by the Second Socialist International, which spread it to Europe, took on in Britain. And certainly in the early days, it was very much about craft trade unionists, so the aristocrats of labour, basically getting dressed up for the day, and it being a big deal, parading through the streets, showing it off it with their regalia. They would have had sashes, they would have banners. But some of the smaller unions, actually, what they did was, like, so the bricklayers and things, they would carry poles with, a golden trowel on it, and different ones. If you go up to John Smith House in Glasgow, on display there is quite an elaborate metal object that's on a pole, which probably 100 years ago was getting carried by the coppersmiths, tinsmiths and sheet metal workers. So it was a way of showing off their skills and also their power. They were huge, the demonstrations. I mean, when I was younger, they were huge. They were always trade union, but from maybe about the 40s onwards, they also developed a political aspect. And I don't actually remember the 40s, but I do remember in the 50s, where what would happen is people would gather in the streets off George Square in Glasgow, march into George Square, and invariably be marching to Queen's Park in the south side. So they would get down to the likes of Renfield Street, and then those with political affiliation, Labour Party, Communist Party, Independent Labour Party even, they would break ranks there and then go to the back of the march and join the various political groupings. And then at the very back would probably be the anarchists, and I'm old enough to remember quite a famous Glasgow anarchist called Guy Aldred, who, unlike a lot of today's anarchists, they were anarchists who were very firmly in the labour movement. They were trade unionists, and I mean, and if you like, establishment trade unions, not the IWW. So it's always been a feature, if you like, on the labour movement in the broadest sense calendar. Well, all my life, and certainly, in between the wars, there's some great photographs of Nye Bevan leading it off side by side with Willie Gallagher, and certainly historically in Glasgow, maybe touching the 70s. If you had a Labour Party speaker one year, and I remember, I think it was in 75, Harold Wilson, the then Prime Minister, actually spoke there in Queen's Park, and it would be here about, if it was a Labour Party person was the key speaker this year, it would be a Communist Party person the next year, and they sort of rotated back and forth. So yes, we would have had Labour leaders from unions there, but we would also have Labour movement leaders from the political side, didn't it? And of course, in Glasgow, we had some very famous times where people like Paul Robeson would come, and he obviously sang and such like. And when he returned to America and had his passport impounded, he wasn't allowed to travel. I think it might have been the first ever, if you like, international broadcast live across the Atlantic to a public gathering like that. So he sung over the phone to the folk gathered in Queen's Park. And yeah, so that's it. It's always been about marching. It's always been about parading. It's always been about having whoever the workers in struggle were at the front, or rather just behind the dignitaries. And it's continued that, but it always has had an entertainment value. It's always had, music, generally of a sort of folkish nature, because that was where a lot of the labour movement were embedded. But it was also within the folk music circle that you would have topical songs written about strikes, about anniversaries of strikes, about victories and defeats of the labour movement. There was often community singing with Avanti Popolo and songs of the Spanish War and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, cheers for that, Keith. That's a great wee breakdown, and
Mm.
the origin is always quite funny when it comes to, I guess, stuff that's circled around the labour movement and the workers' movement, especially Mayday. I think a lot of folk seem to think that massive international events like this are certainly ones that are commemorated almost always originate from the Soviet Union, but goes to show that it does have its place cemented in history with the pagans, but then transformed in America. I think would probably be for many people kind of not attached to the history of the labour movement across the world. America would be the last place they think would be a birthbed of workers kind of commemoration. So no, it's quite interesting seeing the kind of origins of that.
Yeah, it's interesting, but people forget that America has had and has quite a strong labour movement history. When you told me that this was happening, I had a wee flick through Wikipedia. In actual fact, although it's generally recorded as having started in 1886, or the year 1887, I suppose, because it was a commemoration. But there's also a thing that at the tail end of April in 1856, in Australia, the the stonemasons in Victoria, the state of Victoria, so Melbourne, that area, they had a mass stoppage as part of their struggle for an 8-hour day, which was, 30 years before anything was happening in the United States. And incidentally, for those who don't know, and especially those in precarious work, having to work 50 odd hours to get pay, Victoria in Australia was the first place in the world to actually achieve an 8-hour working day. While we were still toiling, I mean, they were getting it in the late 19th century. And as we know, in Glasgow in 1919, the fight for the 40-hour week, the 8-hour day, was still a live issue. So, although we might think that Britain or America are the leaders of things, sometimes, we have to look elsewhere and be less, proud of our history, because other folk might have been making history before we did.
Yeah, no, definitely, keep spot on. And I guess as we kind of go on to the next point, later on in the episode, we'll come to talk about the actual May Day in Glasgow and I guess the kind of future of the Labour movement, if you like, as well. Obviously, we said earlier that you've got many hats, so to speak, with your various different roles, so you're always high in demand. But obviously, for the Glasgow TUC, the Trades Council, there'll be some people who probably aren't familiar with what a trades council is. Just looking to see if you can give a rundown of what you do in the Glasgow Trades Council, who you are, and kind of a wee backdrop into that.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Glasgow Trades Council, and it's been through a number of incarnations, number of names. I'll maybe come on to that, why that is later. But depending on whose history you read, it was founded in 1857 and 1858. And from its start, the Trades Council were always quite a political organisation, because remember, this is a period in which ordinary people didn't have the vote. So it had two functions. One was to bring together the craft trade unions, the skilled workforce together, and it was there to be a protectionist thing, and it was to stop, undercutting of wages. It was so it would collectively be involved in the setting of wages, making sure that one group wasn't undercutting another, and if you like, forming a baseline which people could always fight to go above. But that's the thing, and that would be the engineers. It would be the skilled workers. It wouldn't be what was reckoned as the labouring classes, the unskilled. How you can be unskilled, you have to have a skill for every task. So it was, when I say quasi Masonic, it was secret, closed organisation. Like the Weavers' motto was and is, I would rather eat my shuttle than declare the secrets of my craft, which is a very kind of sort of Masonic in the old sense way of it, because trade unions grew out of the guilds, which were these organisations that were essentially protectionist. But one of the things they were concerned about was representation, because they recognised that you could have strikes, you could win battles in the street, and then you could win battles against employers. But what you needed was legitimacy coming from laws, and you had to then have people in Parliament. And at that time, the Labour movement in the main supported the Liberals, who promised great things, but there was always an agitation from within the Trades Council to actually get their own representation, and they were involved in the birth of the Labour Party and such. Like the Labour Party grew out of the trade unions. But the other function of the trades councils was almost to be like a workers, an alternative to the town council, if you like, a workers' council, one that was pressurising the town council and other legislative bodies like that, is to make sure that the workers' interests were at least getting a voice somewhere. So it had that. So I suppose initially it was made up of the respectable working class rather than the revolutionary working class. And just as an aside, people look to the STUC as being the sort of overarching authoritative trade union body in Scotland. That was actually set up by trades councils, including Glasgow Trades Council. Or the setting up of it was supported by the Trades Council. So the Trades Council in Glasgow, as I say, was established on or around 1857, 1858, depending on who you read. But the STUC wasn't founded until 1897. And that explains, if you like, the difference between trades councils in Scotland and trades councils in England and Wales, and also in Ireland, but that's separate again. In England and Wales, trades councils have their own congress every year. In Scotland, trades councils attend the STUC, and that might just seem like a wee administrative difference, but it's something that is actually very important, because the trades councils bring together people from different trades, from different unions. And when you're in the trades council, although you argue perhaps your own union's policies or, demands and so on, once the trades council takes a decision and you're a member of that trades council, then when on trades council business, you follow the policy and the aims of the trades council. But trades councils can put in 3 motions to the STUC, and if you look back at the last 30, maybe even 40 years, the most progressive motions have come from trades councils, because they're not tied by narrow self-interest of the different trade unions. And an example of that is after, I think that was our 4th year of putting up a motion to the STUC. Glasgow Trades Council won a motion at the STUC just a few weeks ago on not increasing, or to campaign against increasing defence spending. Now, obviously, people like Unite and the GMB and those who have members in the armaments industry, we're not too keen on that, and they're never unlikely to put forward a motion such as that. But the Trades Council, because it represents all workers, if you like, and sees that the dangers that we're facing just now, with increased tensions all over the world, that we can no longer think that there's not the possibility of world war. We can no longer say that's all in the past. So I think that was quite a major victory, that the leading trade union body in Scotland now has a position of no increase in defence spending, at the same time when the Labour Party and lots of other Labour lords like George Robinson, former head of NATO, arguing that we need to increase defence. Defence is important, but so is welfare, so is developing and improving the health service and such like, because if you're spending money in defence, you're not spending it in other things. And I always reflect on that when we see a missile hitting somewhere in Gaza, £1 million a pop or $1 million a pop. Not only are houses getting destroyed in Lebanon, but it means that there's money that should be available for housing in Scotland or America or anywhere else is not there. So I think that's a major and important part of the Trades Council, is acting out with narrow self-interest of trade unions, individual trade unions.
Yeah, no, superb, Keith. Cheers for that. And yeah, I mean, the Trade Council work is really important here in Scotland. You kind of touch on the uniqueness the Trades Council's having that seat, if you like, at the STUC, which following the recent Congress is now going to be biannual after 2027. Catching up just on Tom Morrison's article in the Star in regards to it, certainly shaping up to be kind of interesting, and there is, from being a delegate there previously and a couple of years, you do feel that kind of tension in the room, that clash of heads between the trades councils, between the trades councils and unions such as GMB, Unite or Prospect, when it does come to these kind of subjects, and makes it make some of the end results a lot more bitter. But I think it's testament that there has to be that voice of reason from the trades councils, who are really composed of lay trade union members, of reps, who are just actively involved in the workplace, and they see firsthand, especially in areas like social care and other areas of the public sector, what the current approach to Britain's economic model is. And it's, as you've touched on, it's warfare over welfare, and that's already having a kind of detrimental impact. And resources like the Alternative Defence Review that's been collaborated by, for lack of a better term, more progressive trade unions, perhaps, such as RMT, is showing the economic impact and what that has on Britain. So it gives a kind of stark analysis and the need to shake up the trade union movement, because I think I typically refer back to Eddie Dempsey and some of the quotes he's given about the movement and where it's going. It's at risk of running irrelevant, especially these bigger unions, where although there might be actions and campaigns against Amazon and whatnot that are seeing perhaps an uptake in membership there, the reality is the uptake in democratic procedures within the unions and internal democracy is almost non-existent. The turnouts for general secretary elections and regional elections for executive committees are so low. It's turnouts of barely 10% or 20%, and it brings the question of legitimacy for these people who are elected to these positions to begin with, what mandate they're actually running on, especially when they promote and campaign for an organising strategy that is essentially part and parcel and the carbon copy of what many in the arms industry have been calling and lobbying the Labour government to do, which is pursue and empty the public purse into the private sector. So having that trades council role is really, really great at the STUC, and it can't be understated enough.
Yeah, you're mentioning Eddie Dempsey is actually very topical, because at the STUC we mugged him, and he's actually going to be speaking this Sunday. He's going to be the keynote speaker at the Glasgow Trades Council May Day March this week. So if folk can get along at 10:30 to Barrowland Park, which is just behind Glasgow Cross, they'll not only see Eddie, but there's Martin Kavanagh, who's the president of the PCS. There's a whole series of people. This, of course, is 2026, the 100th anniversary of the general strike. So we've got Ewan Gibbs is going to be speaking there about the general strike. Not just about the general strike, which is it's maybe our most glorious day, but it did show that it worked. General strikes can work, but we just didn't go far enough. But also, what is the relevance of that for today, which is something that's quite interesting. I'm actually not going to hear Eddie on Sunday, because I'm going to be in Belfast, where they have a huge May Day. They have a huge May Day demonstration, much bigger than anything that happens this side of the pond. And it's a tribute to the trade union movement in Ireland, that what they've managed to do all the way through what was, I suppose, known as the Troubles, which is not a term I particularly like. But what you have is that the trade union movement was able to work across a community in a way that no other organisation was, and still keep Labour to the forefront and taking part in actions that served all communities. And the trade union movement probably has, especially in the northeast of Ireland, probably a greater general appreciation of its work than people do in Scotland. in actual fact, since records began, which I think was 1922, the northeast of Ireland has always had the highest density of trade union membership among working people. A wee aside, and maybe can be edited out if not relevant, but it is something that a lot of people find surprising, given the history of that part of our shared islands.
No, perfect, Keith, and a smooth segue into the next point, which is actually on May Day in Glasgow. So we'll go on to that. But yeah, Eddie, good to hear Eddie Dempsey obviously being a speaker for Sunday. I'm also hoping to pinch him as well, snag him and rope him into something GMB and Morning Star related. So aye, like yourself, he's in high demand, so you're in good company. But yeah, May Day in Glasgow then. Always one of my favourite kind of time of year. It's a real chance to commemorate, but as well as that, kind of inspire, and certainly with the kind of range of speakers that you've kind of touched on, that will certainly be the case for a lot of them. You've got obviously Eddie Dempsey, like you said, Sophie Johnson from Stop the War, Ewan Gibbs, as you've mentioned. I'm not going to try pronounce this comrade's name because I'll definitely get it wrong, but the political director of the Workers' Party of Belgium is also going to be there. And
David,
as I said as well,
David's his first name.
yeah, we'll go for that. It's simpler. And Martin Kavanagh as well, and probably a couple other speakers in it, as I can imagine. And some live music and stuff as well. And when you've got speakers like that, it's a great kind of chance for inspiration, trying to bring more folk to the trade union kind of front and learning about the class struggle and the labour movement. But the May Day march and the Sunday isn't all that is happening in Glasgow or has happened in previous years. Obviously, yourselves in the Glasgow TUC have done terrific work in terms of kind of May Day programmes and having multiple events running on in coordination with that, just to see if you can give us a kind of rundown then of May Day in Glasgow, what's going on today, what's happening with the programme, obviously the march on Sunday, and you've already touched on kind of start of the episode about the, I guess, history and some historical May Day events in Glasgow in the past, but if anything else springs to mind, then feel free to tie it in.
Yep, just I will do that because May Day isn't just the actual day. May Day for Glasgow Trades Council started last weekend and will go on until the final event on the 10th of May. So there's quite a lot going on. I mean, so far we had the other night in Unity Books in the south side of Glasgow, there was a launch of a book, unsurprisingly, about the general strike, which was a launch. So it varies from a book launch. Last night we had organised a hustings with the various parties. We've got a general election this time next week, but we were organised a meeting, invited all the parties, and then basically, what about the workers? You know, what's in it for us? So we had particular demands from the way migrant workers have been treated, the way that it's almost a form of bonded slavery, because when migrant workers come and work here, they don't have a visa as such. Their employer has a visa, and the employer can tell them, no, I'm not allowing you to use one of the visas that we have. So it makes it very difficult for those workers to organise. So we were talking about that, although it's not a devolved matter. It's held at what's the Scottish Parliament going to do about that, down to just, we've got workers' rights being devolved, and we want to make sure there's an improvement in maybe what exists at present and so on, about welfare, just a whole series of things like that. We would take maybe a very pro-worker view of it, and we put it on, and I would have to say a few folk the politicians were squirming last night, and in fact some of them just couldn't answer the question because they hadn't actually considered that we would be that what workers expect from elected members is maybe a bit different from the ordinary punter on the street who's not involved in the trade union movement. So we've done that. It's not all serious stuff. There's a football tournament, which I have to say folk take fairly serious. There's the Great May Day Cabaret, which takes place on the Monday night, and it's taking place in Webster's. Well, not what was Webster's, is now the Stand Comedy Club. It's in there this Monday. David Heyman, probably Scotland's greatest living actor, is going to be doing his bit. We've got the Tenementals playing, and they used the President's Dinner at the STUC as a rehearsal for their new single that's coming out, because it's not only the 100 years since the general strike, it's 90 years since the start of the Spanish Civil War, and they're bringing out a single even to commemorate the start of that war. So without being, there is something for everybody, I feel like, you know. And in actual fact, it used to be an awful lot bigger. In the 80s, we actually had a festival that almost rivaled what was happening in Edinburgh, except it happened in May. It was called Mayfest. It grew out of a collaboration with the arts officer of the STUC and various other arts organisations who felt that the labour movement wasn't properly represented in culture of Scotland, and we needed to address that. It was really popular. It took theatre and both drama, comedy, music to the peripheral schemes of Glasgow. And that was important because the trade unions, when I was growing up, were central, if you like, to what happened in working class life. I grew up in Renfrew, and there the community associations, the tenants associations, inevitably were the secretaries, the chairs, were senior stewards, maybe even conveners on the works. And what that did was it took, if you like, the expertise of the labour movement, and I would also be honest and say some money, into the tenants movement. And that was a time when we had almost universal council housing. I think something like 12% of people were owner-occupiers. And they would be involved in, like I remember, we did quite a famous rent strike when the council doubled the rent. Or proposed to double the rent. We had occupations. We were the lead item in the news at 10. And that was in many ways because the tenants associations took the lessons of the industrial labour movement into the community, and it was successful. They didn't put it up by 50%, they did put it up by 25%, which took the steam, if you like, out of the rent strike, because what we did was we organised collecting people's rents, not paying it to the council, and then paying it. We would only pay it in when there was a victory, but it was still a victory of sorts. It was still a 25% increase, but it wasn't the 50% increase that was happening elsewhere on this island. So we've lost that bit of where we're embedded in working class communities, and I think part of that was to do with the sale of council houses. Where I grew up, there was literally lawyers in council houses. There was very skilled engineers. There was labourers. Everybody stayed in a council house. What happened with the sale of council houses is many people bought their council houses because it became economically more efficient. I myself refused to buy my council house, but because I was in quite a well-paid job and they changed the way they supported council housing, instead of it going in a block grant to the council, and the council could decide if it was going to do repairs, or if it was going to put in new kitchens, new central heating, so on and so forth, they actually transferred it onto the individual, which meant with your benefits, you didn't actually have to pay rent, you would get housing benefit. But if you were well paid, you paid a much higher rent. And in actual fact, it was cheaper for me to buy a flat in Glasgow than to continue to pay for my flat, my council flat in Renfrew, which is why I ended up staying in Glasgow. I bought within the private sector because I was opposed to sales of council houses. Sorry, I went a bit off track there, but the fight against the sales of council houses was something that trades councils and trade unions generally were very much involved in. So we had that community aspect, and that's something that we have to try and rebuild and re-engage, because trade union membership just now it's its lowest ebb. When I first went to a trades council meeting in the late 70s, there was over 200 delegates there. On a good night in Glasgow Trades Council, we have a couple of dozen people there. Something about trades councils is they are open to all trades unionists. Now, any trade unionist can go to any trades council. You may not be able to participate unless the chair thinks that what you've got to say is relevant or pertinent to the business of the trades council. But you have the right to go and observe and report back to your colleagues and work and so on. And it's something I would urge trade unions to go. Some people think that the trades council is something that happens with other people. But all of the delegates around the table are delegates from trade union branches in the city. There's two ways you can join a trades council. You can join it where you stay, or you can join it where you work. So, you know, if you live in Ballach but work in Glasgow, you've basically got a choice of, you know, joining Clydebank, which covers Western Bartonshire, or you can join Glasgow. And that's maybe something we don't advertise enough. It's getting better, the attendance, and it's really, really good that we're getting young workers from areas of employment like hospitality are coming in, precarious workers, people who maybe felt they were adjacent to the labour movement rather than integral to it. But given the nature of work patterns having changed, it's important that they're represented and their views and their needs are getting met and their demands are getting taken elsewhere through the Trades Council.
Yeah, no, superb, Keith. And yeah, I guess just to bring it back to May Day in Glasgow, football tournament, definitely taking serious. I'm having sleepless nights already thinking about winning. But things like that are great. It's a great way to kind of get folk who maybe aren't kind of trade union conscious, class conscious, kind of into it, gets them into that environment, and then you can develop them from there, engage them into kind of further trade union work, and like you say, with the kind of trades council stuff as well. So it's fantastic. And
yeah, I agreed. Who would have thought that football in Glasgow could be a unifying force and bring folk together? It's often seen as a polarising thing, but there you are. It's getting used for good as well.
For a change. Now you kind of touched on some of the points there about I guess young workers getting involved in that on in the trades councils and their union, etc. I guess then just to tie it in with May Day and the importance of these kind of celebrations, we did say earlier that, you know, it is a chance to commemorate, it is a chance to celebrate, but it also is a kind of rallying call, just to see if you can give us a kind of underpinning then of, you know, the importance of May Day, and I guess what the kind of future has in store, if we like, or a future we need to see for May Day and the wider labour movement.
Well, I think the call this weekend for May Day, the call to everyone will be how precarious peace is at present. You know, I'm just, before we come on, I was listening to the news and they were talking about the price of oil being at its highest since the last highest price. And that's because there's rumours of more attacks on Lebanon. So I think the call for peace is probably the most revolutionary demand the trade union movement can make just now. We live in a nuclear age. you know, we know that Israel secretly has nuclear weapons. We know that we've got somebody in the White House who is talking about, you know, blowing civilizations back to the Stone Age. Well, he has the capacity and the ability and the weapons he has. So we need to keep up the call for peace. We also need to get people involved in trade unions. There is a trade union literally for anyone. You know, those who are in trades, there are the trades that cover it. But there are general unions. Unite has sections for those in precarious work. They even have a section for people not in work, Unite Community. And that's for people who are older, maybe retired, and don't fit the criteria for Unite's retired members. It's for people in precarious work. It's people who are out of work. It's for people who have disabilities and rely on benefits to live. So therefore, it campaigns for those people in the way that, you know, we can't campaign for wages, but we can campaign for better welfare. We can campaign and do against benefit sanctions and such like. We can work in tandem with the retired members about loss of winter fuel allowances and stuff. So what I would say to MD listening to this who says, oh, I really support trade unions, I really think it's a good thing, but I'm not part of one myself because there's nowhere for me. There is, you know, there definitely is for every person, every worker, whether you're working on a 0 hours contract, which should be abolished, or whether you're in full-time work or anything in between, or even because of age or health or whatever reason you're not actually able to work, then there is a place for you in the trade union movement. And I think that's a message that really goes out, not just in May Day, but every day and every time people are trade unionists are talking, you know, out in the peripheral schemes. I've been out there doing about bringing the energy, bringing utilities back into public ownership. You know, that would help cut, you know, bills in an instant. And it also then means we can look at why are we producing energy? We can start looking at tariffs that are specifically for people in low wages, people who are living in benefits, people with disability who, because of their disability, actually need, even in a nice day like today, need heating on and such like, just because of the, you know, the particular illnesses and conditions that they have. So there's something there for everybody. And if you're in a trade union, you're not just a member, you're a participant in developing what the policy of that union is. You can actually influence it through your branch, through your union structures, and through membership of the Trades Council that can then take it to the top level, the STUC, and win the call for bringing utilities back into public ownership. It's a major battle in England for water to come back into public ownership for trades councils. We don't have that battle, but we do have a battle coming up with the absence of national health dental services in every community as more and more dentists go totally private. So those are things that we can and do campaign on.
Oh, superb, Keith. Cheers for that. And yeah, a good kind of message to kind of round off with for May Day. We have touched kind of throughout about the even the current state of the union, some drawbacks and whatnot, but for many folk, I say many folk, for some of the kind of elements of the so-called ultra left who refuse to participate in the unions, they essentially hand it over to those who are willing to infiltrate and sabotage and whatnot. Likewise, when it comes to elections where they refuse to participate, and that kind of coliseum, it's another. The trade unions again are just another area for class.
Another area of struggle.
Yeah, and I look back to kind of times when I've been looking at certainly the party's history here in Scotland, looking at Bill McLean in the NUM when he talks about, you know, the trade union struggle just being part of the wider class struggle and the roles, the basic roles that the trade unions have, and what else they should have a responsibility to fight for. And I think if some young people are feeling kind of disenfranchised or that's not happening, well, as we've kind of touched on from this, the trades councils is a place to begin that kind of contest and build up these kind of networks of local grassroots activists who are in the same boat and begin kind of laying that foundation for challenging these kind of dominant positions that are long held in the unions as well. So it's certainly, they don't call it a struggle for nothing, I suppose.
Yeah, no. And class war is no different from any other war. We fight it on many fronts. The trade unions are part of it. Communities are another. We fight it. Wherever there is oppression, wherever the boss class are interfering with our lives, we need to be there to counteract that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess just to kind of finish off and round off, just any kind of final talking points from yourself, whereabouts can we find Glasgow TUC and that on social media, and perhaps the Mayday programme as well, and any kind of further information like that?
Yeah, well, you'll find the Mayday programme on our Facebook page. I know that's maybe old-fashioned. There will be posters going up all over the place in the current days. There's some already up. One thing I would draw attention to is look out for this year's T-shirt is an ABC of a trade unionism, what we stand for, and that goes from safety, health and safety, which going back to the 74 Act was brought in because the Labour Party was forced to agree to health and safety because of the deaths that were taking place in industry. Nobody should go out to work and not come home because they die at work. We've just had International Workers' Memorial Day there on the 28th of April, and there's still, on average, somebody every week of the year dies at work. It was over 50 people died in 2024, which is the last year that the figures are out for. And that's something that's wrong. And the bulk of those things, the bulk of those deaths were avoidable. And that's ridiculous in the 21st century. The law that came in 74 was the TUC basically says we will support the election of a Labour government, but here's amongst our demands. And it came in. The problem now is because of cutbacks in employment, that the inspectors are not as there's not as many of them now as there once was, which has led to laws only work, rules only work if there's somebody there to enforce them and check that they've been honoured, and that's something that sadly hasn't been happening. But yeah, so we're there for the fun things, but also there for the serious things like preventing deaths in work.
Yeah, perfect, Keith. Thanks for that. And again, just thanks for taking the time out your busy schedule, as always, for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a joy, and just hope to see you all marching on Sunday.
Thanks again, comrades, for tuning in to another episode of Spectre. As always, be sure to leave us a like and review on whatever platform you're tuning in on. And of course, share us with your friends, comrades, co-workers, and everyone else in between. This episode will be released on May Day, the 1st of May, International Workers' Day. As we've touched on, it's a chance for celebration, for rejoicing, for remembering the great victories that our class has fought and struggled for, even the most simplest concessions. However, we know that these concessions are not enough. The destiny of our class, and indeed the destiny of this planet, has to be in our hands. So whilst May Day is a chance to celebrate, it must also be the chance to organise, to regroup, and to plot a path forward for our destiny. So enjoy this episode. Enjoy May Day. Enjoy the marches, the trade union football matches, the radical walking tours, and everything else in between. Enjoy it, because tomorrow Well, tomorrow we have a war to win, a class war.